Antarctic surface waters in play, and those surface waters are separated by the east and west wind drifts, and that's where the Antarctic divergence occurs. Now, the other thing that's happening, of course, as we're the further north you are, the more solar radiation is coming in and heating the ocean, and as it proceeds south, it loses much of that heat. And when we get down to the polar regions, either in the north or south, we have much colder waters than we do at the tropics, where the heat input is greatest into the oceanic waters. When the waters get to the poles, you notice that the cold water goes down, and of course that's an area covered by ice. We may see this, we may not. The last ice charts would indicate that we probably will not see this, the view with the much of this area covered by first-year sea ice. We'll probably see isolated patches of that as we get down to the continent. So the circulation of the Southern Ocean, we've already talked about with the circulation of the west wind drift clockwise around the continent and the east wind drift counterclockwise around it. The nutrients have come up here, and that means there's lots of productivity biologically. So this shows the phytoplankton, that's the vegetation type things. We're talking about algae, for example, single-celled algae. They're coming up, and you can see by the intensity here around the continent, the red and orange areas are where we have tremendous amounts of productivity of the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton, of course, are eaten by the zooplankton, and particular interest are the krill. Now remember, the krill are almost the bottom of the food chain. The seals rely on them, some penguin species rely on them, the baleen whales rely on them, and so on. Many of the fish species rely on them. So this is a critical critter, almost shrimp-like critter that you can see here. It gives you an idea of the size held out in a hand as the bottom of the food chain. And what's happening as the sea ice melts, the food for the krill is diminished. Why? Because at the bottom of the sea ice is where the phytoplankton, the algae, for example, are, and that's where the krill feed. And as that ice vanishes, there is less food available for the krill, and that's one of the reasons the krill as a mass of group is diminishing. There's another reason, of course. It's also being exploited by mining, because the krill is then processed and used as feed for fish farms, particularly the salmon fish industry. With the warming temperatures, two things are happening. One, the sea ice is melting. The food source, relatively speaking, for the krill is diminishing, number one. And number two, as that increases in temperature, it means that some of the species have to move to cooler portions of the ocean because they cannot survive the different temperatures. Most of the marine species live in a very narrow temperature range, and that temperature range, as it warms, means they need to move further south, or in the northern hemisphere further north, to survive. That's related in part to the melting of the sea ice, and obviously to global warming. So if we look at the Antarctic food web, you'll see that we have the phytoplankton down here. Many of those are living on the bottom of the sea ice. That's the ice that's floating in the ocean, having nothing to do with glaciers. It's just frozen seawater. And the krill feed on the phytoplankton, and you can see in this illustration the krill are the food source for many seals, birds, fish, squid, elephant seals, penguins, some of the baleen whales, and some of the smaller toothed whales all rely on the krill. So let's review. In the Southern Ocean, the subtropical convergence, everybody remembers what that is, right? That's where we have a temperature drop of about 6 degrees Celsius, 11 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's the beginning and northern limit of the Southern Ocean. So as soon as we left Ushuaia and the Beagle Channel and got out into the open sea, we were in the Southern Ocean. Second, probably the most important thing from a biological viewpoint is the Antarctic convergence, or the polar front. There's a sudden temperature drop, which I showed you some illustrations of, that takes place during spring, summer, late summer, almost into autumn, of somewhere between 3 and 6 degrees Celsius, or 3 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the biological boundary of the Southern Ocean, with enormous increases in biological activity to the south. Birds, whales, seals, squid, everything is enormously enhanced at that boundary as we move forth further to the south, and we have a huge number of, a large number of food sources and nutrients coming into play, which permits the massive explosion of biological activity. And we have the Antarctic divergence, which is the boundary between the east and west winds in the area.
Bút gì? Chưa tới cái ấy mà sao đưa được?
This is the zone where many of the nutrients from the north that upwell from the deep of the oceans come right up against the continent. And that's the circumpolar deep water that is upwelled with enormous amounts of nutrients just around the perimeter of the Antarctic continent. That's where we're headed. That's where we'll be seeing seals, whales, birds. Probably won't see the fish unless you've got X-ray vision, but they're there. And krill you may or may not, you probably will not see from the ship, but there'll be masses of krill in portions of the ocean as we come through the Antarctic Peninsula boundary. Circulation of the Southern Ocean, as I've indicated, is clockwise. The mass of water is clockwise around the continent, with less, much narrower counterclockwise current system, taking up about 28% of the water, whereas this is taking up close to 60% of the ocean water circulation patterns. So we're likely to see some icebergs. I think you should be on the lookout for those starting late afternoon, early evening tonight and tomorrow. There's a chance of spotting an iceberg that's floating off of the peninsula and off into the South Shetland Islands. And if we're lucky, right now I notice it's a little cloudy out there, but if we're lucky we may see a sunset like this. So what I hope I've been able to do is give you some understanding of the ocean that we're traversing right now, and if you have any questions, because there's something going on in the Gaspé, I'll be outside on the 6th level here on the port side, just outside the door as you exit if you have any questions. Thank you very much.